Welcome to the MyKitaab podcast, a podcast on book publishing in India. 3 times a week, your host, Amar Vyas, will interview authors, translators, editors, and publishers to learn how to get your books published in India.
A big hello and welcome to the MyKitaab podcast. My name is Amar Vyas and I will be your host along this exciting journey that we are about to begin. In this episode, which is the introductory episode, I will talk about the who, what, when, where, why and how of this podcast. I'm recording this episode on January 14th, 2016 to provide a timeline to those who might listen to this show at a future date. Let us begin with the what. The word kitab means a book in Hindi and many Indian languages, and MyKitaab literally means my book. As Kit, a fellow podcaster from the History of India podcast, noted, kitab has a similar meaning in Arabic and several other languages. The writer Al-Baruni wrote a book called Kitab Tariq al-Hind, which literally means a book on history of India nearly 1,000 years ago. That was a little bit of a history and then the geography and then the linguistics behind the name. So now that the name was settled, we, that is my wife and I, thought what should be the theme of this podcast. We thought about the dilemma that I was faced with a couple of years ago, namely, I have written a book, how do I get it published in India? I'm sure many authors will be faced with this question. In order to answer this, we will talk to industry experts, authors, editors, publishers, and a longer journey, we will also talk about translations of books into Indian languages. India is a land of many languages, and a conversation about books remains incomplete if we do not talk about translations. In its simplest form, MyKitaab is a podcast on book publishing in India. Many of you may be new to the world of podcasts, so let me put it in a different way. 3 times a week, we will discuss with authors, publishers, editors, and other stakeholders in the value chain of book publishing. And we will talk to them for about 30 to 35 minutes in the form of a discussion. This discussion would be available in the form of audio files. You can download them through iTunes, listen to them directly from MyKitaab website or Facebook. On the MyKitaab website, that is www.mykitab.in, and in the show notes for this episode, I have included a list of ways in which you can listen to this podcast, mykitab.in. Now let's talk about the why. Why am I starting this podcast? Well, 2 years ago, that was in December 2013, I had completed the manuscript for my debut novel, NRI, Now Returned to India. When I started approaching publishers for getting my novel published, I received the usual set of rejections from 22 of them. That's when my wife and I began to research into the book publishing market in India. We wanted to understand the publishing process. And we got so carried away that somehow we ended up spending close to 250 hours in research between the two of us. And that is a lot of time spent in learning about a market. When I did a quick back of the envelope calculation, I realized that in these 250 hours, one could have easily written 3 to 4 50,000 word novels, depending on how fast one can write them. Some could have probably done much more than that. After we ended up self-publishing my debut novel, I resolved that I will put the information that we have gathered in a compilation that would serve as a resource for authors, some of which I shall narrate now. First of all, there are several excellent how-to resources on the internet put together by authors, publishers, and book lovers alike that will help the authors in solving exactly the kind of problems my wife and I faced. In the show notes for this podcast, I have provided a small list of resources that I think would be very helpful. Second, the information gets quickly dated, so it is important to keep updating it. And this is very important for readers to keep in mind how recent or relevant the article they are reading. Thirdly, the majority of the resources were in the form of text, that is, books, blogs, etc. As such, there was going to be very little incremental benefit if I wrote another how-to kind of a guide. And finally, by extension, there was very little information available in the form of audio or video. I found video to be helpful for tutorials. For example, using Scrivener for writing and formatting the manuscript. Scrivener is a software that can be used both on the PC or Mac or even Linux like I do, and we will talk at length about Scrivener in a subsequent podcast episode. But wait a minute, in case you are wondering why am I narrating the story about how I ended up self-publishing my novel, let us go back to the problem statement that I had defined at the beginning of this recording, and that is, I have written a book and how do I get it published in India? Now let us go back to how the above observations that drove me to the world of podcasts again. And I say again because I have been an avid podcast listener since 2006. Talk about an early adapter who fell off the grid and then rediscovered podcasts. In early 2006, I used to live in Chicago, and during my commute to work, I used to listen to NPR's Car Talk, the Manager Tools podcast, CEO Exchange. This went on for nearly 2 years. When I moved back to India in 2008, for nearly next 2 years, I did not listen to much audio content. First of all, I was unable to find good podcasts from India. And at that time, FM radio and listening to Bollywood music became the default medium of audio that I consumed. Over the next 2 years, I was hardly an audiophile. But in late 2012, I came to know about a new podcast by a then unknown person called John Lee Dumas. My interest and eventually love for podcast rekindled around that time. Speaking of Kindle, interestingly enough, I have been listening to podcasts related to books, how to write them, how to get them published, how to market them, etc. over the past 2 years. It's funny that my podcasting journey has been evolving in chunks of 2 years at a time. Days I listen to the self-publishing podcast, the Creative Pen podcast, Sell More Book Show, a lot of very interesting. Towards early 2015, I began to feel that I was getting a lot of information from these shows, but they largely spoke about the US market, which is the largest market for books in the world. That's when a thought came to my mind, what is happening with the Indian book publishing industry? There are some great resources online, including For Writers by Authors group on Facebook, and sites that interview authors, editors, and publishers such as writerstory.com and ebookindia.com. They largely cater to the Indian authors, publishers, and I will post the links to these sites in the show notes. There was very little information in audio format. In fact, I did, however, find a few YouTube videos from a conference called as Publishing Next, and I will post a link to them in the show notes. So around that time, I thought that why not start a podcast on book publishing in India myself. Between April and July 2015, I revisited all the forums, websites, and notes that I had compiled from my research. Remember the 250 hours my wife and I had spent? Well, I ended up spending another 50 or 60 hours. But slowly, the idea of MyKitaab podcast began to take shape. What also became evident was that most of the resources spoke about the market for English language books. Again, there was very little information about the regional language books and also about translations. What a shame, I thought to myself. In a country that is blessed with hundreds of languages and 22 official languages, many of which are spoken by tens of millions of people, we only get to hear about one language, and that is English. But I thought that trying to do a deep dive into the book market for each one of the major languages, and there are about 7 or 8 of them spoken by nearly 60 or 70 million people, it was going to be a very complex task, and more so because simply I was not aware about the movers and shakers in the book publishing market for these languages. A podcast that would initially focus on the English language books seemed like a good starting point. If the idea worked, there was always an opportunity to pick up one language every month, say 7 or 8 months down the line. Podcast I was going to launch would have hopefully gained traction by then. Now let us talk about the who. Who is this podcast for? I have 2 types of listeners in mind when I think of the target audience for this podcast. The first type are professionals who are working in India and have finished their manuscript, and now they're looking for resources and help to get their book published. The second group of listeners are authors who live outside of India and would like to learn more about the book publishing market here. At some point in time, they would want to get their books published, but they have very little information about the book publishing market in India. This is particularly true for independent authors, and while selling ebooks is pretty much a no-brainer today, and you can do so through Kindle, Kobo, iBooks, etc. For print books, there are several unknowns in the process. particularly since there is very little awareness about print-on-demand providers such as CreateSpace or Ingram Spark in the Indian market. There are at least 2 or 3 very good print-on-demand service providers here in this country, but we will get into this discussion in detail in a subsequent podcast episode or episodes. Authors or book lovers who are interested in learning about the finer aspects of book publishing, editing, marketing, copyright, and other relevant matters are also welcome listeners. Let me also mention here that this podcast is not positioned as a resource for authors who need to get help in writing. You see, I only have 1 book under my belt at this point in time, and while I'm writing 3 more, and it would be a great opportunity to learn more about the book writing process as I am writing the books myself, I don't think I'm qualified to talk about the whole book review process or the writing process. So that is the reason why I decided to exclude these 2 aspects of book publishing. Moving on to where. Where can you access the content for this podcast? For those of you who are familiar with podcasting, the answer is simple. iTunes, Stitcher or TuneIn Radio or any of the programs called podcatchers are also logical places to find this podcast. There are applications called podcatchers who will point you to the RSS feed through which you can download the episodes on your smartphone or tablet or any other listening device. And as I learned recently, Facebook is another interesting way of linking the uploaded files onto the Facebook page for your podcast, and we will do the same for MyKitaab podcast as well. I would like to mention that at the time of this recording, podcasting in India is at a very nascent stage with only about 30 or 40 shows that are active. The number is growing, but many potential listeners aren't even aware of podcasts as a category, let alone know where they can access the content. I have created a short document called How to Listen to Podcasts for their benefit, and I hope that in a small way, this document will enable listeners to access, download, listen, and learn from the discussions with my guest. I also hope that once they get used to accessing the audio content in this medium, they will begin to explore more shows and thus help in the growth of podcasting in India. I have created a second document called How to Leave Reviews for Podcasts. This document is largely focused on leaving review on iTunes. And with time, I hope to update this document to include other sites which will help the audience who use apps on Android or access the content by other means such as TuneIn or Stitcher. Let us move on to the when. That is when I am launching the podcast and when can you listen to the episodes. The good news is that today, 14th January 2016, MyKitaab podcast will be officially live. Each week going forward, there will be 3 episodes every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. My original plan was to launch this podcast in November 2015, just before Diwali, which means that by now, that is in mid-January 2016, there would have been nearly 25 shows online. But at that point in time, I was working in a full-time job that required me to travel almost non-stop, and it took a toll on podcasting. It was also getting difficult to schedule interviews with guests, and since MyKitaab is a discussion-based podcast with the guests, it certainly was a necessary and a sufficient condition. That's when I had a conversation with my wife Mrunal, and we decided that the only way to do this right was to do it full-time. And that would also allow me to focus on my writing, which has taken a hit over the past few months because of my crazy working hours and the travel. Now let us talk about the how. That is, how will this podcast be structured? MyKitaab would be a discussion-based show. I do not like to use the term interview because that's not what this podcast is. It is a discussion between book lovers. Most episodes would be about 30 to 35 minutes each. A few of them could be longer or shorter. I do not believe in sticking to a time-bound schedule. After all, if a conversation with a friend is interesting enough, do we simply get up and walk away? Most likely not. But let us not deviate from the topic here. MyKitaab podcast would be structured in 3 segments. Well, 4 if you include the customized biographies of the guests that I like to narrate. If I find something interesting about a guest that is not mentioned in their regular bio, say a guest who is a management consultant on weekdays, an author on weeknights, and plays in a band on weekends, I will go ahead and mention it. It'll also add a little bit of spice to the show. Let us talk about the structure of each episode itself. We will spend the first 5 or 6 minutes of each episode getting to know the guest. That is a great opportunity to connect with them. The second segment would focus on the skill or the subject matter expertise that they possess. This will form the bulk of the discussion for nearly 20 or 25 minutes. Say you're an author, then we will talk about your writing process, experiences with publishers, reviews, writing habits, and so on. For a publisher, we will ask about market segments, market size, publishing trends, etc. The final segment would be a rapid fire round, which I like to call 5 for 5. I would ask the guest 5 questions and they would have a minute to answer each one of them. I will try to bring in as much data, as many facts and figures into the conversation as possible. Information that will be specific. I'm a numbers guy after all. At least I used to be in my corporate career. And I strongly believe, for example, the market for Hindi books in India is 30% of the overall market is much more relevant than saying, well, the market for books in Hindi language is greater than the market for English language books. You get the picture? And now finally, let's talk about who am I and what qualifies me to be a podcast host. The second part of my question was tongue-in-cheek, and I would like to answer that first. My only qualifications are that I love content in the form of audio. Secondly, I'm a good listener, and most importantly, I like to help people. If you think that these are not good enough attributes, I encourage you to listen to a couple of podcast episodes. The insights provided by the guests and the value they create in the process will make you stick around. Coming to who am I? As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, my name is Amar Vyas and I am a husband, an author, a nature lover, a dog lover, and now a podcaster. Amar Vyas is my pen name. I write fiction under this name. In my professional world, I am known as Amar Deshpande, and you can look me up on LinkedIn to know more about that part of my life. I live in Bengaluru or Bangalore in India with my wife and our dog Buddy. Before taking up writing and podcasting, I was a program manager for Amazon. My other professional adventures include working in energy consulting, real estate, and I was a construction manager used to build retail stores for a general contractor in the US. Somewhere in between, I got an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and I am also an alumnus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. But on this podcast, I am an author and a book lover who wants to help other authors, and that will remain my identity. Before I conclude, let me say that today is January 14th. The day is celebrated as Makar Sankranti in Maharashtra, the state in western part of India where I originally come from. In northern India, it is celebrated as Uttarayan, and so also in the state of Gujarat. Many parts of northern India is festival of Lohri, that's Lohri. Confused by different names for a same festival by now? Don't worry, they all carry the same message. Mainly, the duration of daytime will increase by a small amount every day from today onwards. And today, my wife and I wish you Tir Gud Ghya God Bola. In the Marathi language, it means have some sweets, in this case, jaggery made out of sugarcane and linseed seeds. And by eating it, may you let go of any bitterness or any anger that might have built up within you. And may you speak sweet words that come straight from the heart. I would like to conclude this episode of the MyKitaab podcast, and I welcome you aboard to a very exciting journey ahead. I look forward to your feedback and comments, and thank you for your time and patience in listening to this episode.
Thank you for listening. If you like this show, please leave a review. You can also subscribe to the newsletter by visiting www.mykitab.in. That's MyKitaab.in.